What about species? Well, Rolston makes a number of arguments here as well. One is that species are a kind of life, like individual organisms are. So this is an interesting kind of interpretation of what species are. He suggests that this is a case where biology has actually taught us something about the world. As he calls it, a biologically based counterexample to the focus on individuals. Before we study biology or we study ecology, we don't really have a good sense of what a species is. But once we understand what a species is in terms of evolutionary history and in terms of, basically in terms of it being like the basic kind of diversity within the larger set of ecological relationships, that each species typically play some kind of relatively consistent role within ecological processes. They have a certain kind of evolutionary consistency. They've come into existence by an evolutionary process, and that the individuals of the species, even though of course they vary to some extent, their variation is around a common mean, or a common range of options that is distinctive of that species, or is characteristic, I should say, perhaps more specifically, is characteristic of that species. So when we know that an individual organism is a wolf, for instance, or we know that an individual organism is an oak, that tells us something about that individual organism, knowing that it's part of that species, because the species is a type of organism that individual falls into the category of, or is a member of that group or that type. And biology teaches us that this is a kind of life, says Rolston, that species are as real, even though they're instantiated only in individuals. That is, if you don't have any individuals, you can't have a species. Nonetheless, the species itself is a real thing. It has distinctive features. The species is not. Now, Rolston doesn't say this exactly, but I think this is an implication of his way of describing this. A species is not reducible to just each of the individuals that make it up. A species is not simply identical to all of the individuals that make it up. It has its own kind of reality, its own kind of consistency. It exists and persists through time. It's come into existence through a certain process, and it may one day go out of existence. And so that chunk of the world, that part of the world that has a certain organization and a certain character, is something we can recognize after studying some biology and some ecology. And those fields themselves have helped to clarify what this natural object is that we call a species. And we can recognize then that natural object has value as a form of life, just like individual organisms have value as a form of life. So what we see is that our category of life, which we take to be something valuable, and we had arguments for why that is in regard to plants as well as animals in the last few slides. But now we're extending this concern for life, not just to individual organisms, but to these kind of units of these larger units of life, which are species. And the next argument is that if we think it's wrong to kill an individual organism without justification, then it should be considered even more wrong to kill a species. Because when we kill a species, we're not only killing lots of individuals, but we're also killing a whole way of life. We're killing a whole, this kind of larger category or group level form that life takes, which is the species. And so we need even more justification. As he calls it, we need a super justification for this super killing It's interesting to call extinction, driving a species to extinction, a super killing. What that implies is it's not just a killing of the individuals, but it's a kind of higher order killing, and therefore it's an even worse kind of killing. You might think here, interestingly, of like a parallel with murder or killing in war and genocide, right? Genocide is like the elimination or the attempted elimination of an entire group of people, an entire way of life, an entire culture, or an entire ethnicity. And if you think that there's something that's wrong about genocide that goes above and beyond just the wrongness of killing the individual humans that are part of whatever group one is acting genocidally towards, then it's the same kind of reasoning here. I mean, again, Rolston doesn't draw that parallel exactly, but I think, to try to make sense of what he has in mind here, I think it's a fair parallel to draw. If you think there's something especially wrong about genocide in comparison just with killing individuals, then you might think also there's something especially wrong about specieside, right? The elimination of an entire species or extinction of a species in comparison with just killing the individuals of the species. Now, there are some more arguments that Rolston offers, but I want to pause here for a moment just to discuss a few of his examples. These are examples to show that conservationists do sometimes choose to preserve species rather than individual organisms. So they will sacrifice individual organisms for the sake of preserving or conserving a species. So an example he gives is that there were 3 endangered plant species in an area, and some of the conservationists, the kind of people who had some authority over the area, were planning to kill goats, feral goats, meaning goats that have escaped from captivity and have propagated in the wild, to preserve these 3 endangered plant species. Otherwise, the goats would have, driven those plant species to extinction. So killing individual goats, which are not part of an endangered species, in order to preserve 3 species of plants. And that this makes sense to a lot of conservationists. So Rolston is trying to a lot of people who are trained in the science of ecology and have positions of authority making decisions about how some wilderness area is managed, some refuge area is managed. So the example is just supposed to show us that this is already a value judgment that some people make, and Rolston thinks that in many cases this is the right value judgment to make, that sometimes species should be preserved, even if it means the death of more individuals than you've preserved in the species that you've preserved. Just one other example I'll discuss is of a decision made by conservationists in Yellowstone National Park about whether to save a bison that had fallen into the ice and fallen into the water, basically trapped in the ice, drowned, and whether to save some grizzlies that had wandered away from their usual feeding area across some ice that then melted, and they would have had trouble getting back to the area where they normally live. And Rolston reports that conservationists did not take any effort to save the bison. They let the bison drown, but they did make efforts to save the grizzlies. And the rationale for that is that there are plenty of bison, and the bison will die and then in the water and then will become food for a lot of other animals. The grizzlies are an endangered species, and they're something like apex predators. Maybe they're apex predators, or they're predators very high up in the pyramid, and to use Leopold's term. And so it's important to preserve them because they have certain other ecological effects. So the grizzlies were preserved partly because they're endangered, partly because they're important to the ecosystem, whereas the bison was not. Some of the other arguments that Rolston offers for the moral status of species are as follows. So he argues that billions of years of evolution were required to generate the species that we see, and our species has the power to change that. wouldn't it be better, he says, for us to respect this long evolution than just to destroy it or use it for selfish reasons? So we're products of evolution, and so is all of this biological diversity. And part of the product of evolution in our own case is that we have the ability to reflect on what we do and make decisions deliberately. And Rolston is arguing that for us to just eliminate species with no concern but our own short-term interests is, or even our own species-specific long-term interests, that we would just be doing it for anthropocentric reasons, it just seems like not the best way for us to behave in the context of this long evolution that has produced both us and all of these other species on Earth. The next argument is, in quotation from Rolston, life on Earth is a many-splendored thing. Extinction dims its luster. So I'm not sure exactly what, how to interpret this, but it does seem like what he's saying is that there's tremendous diversity on Earth. That diversity is beautiful, right? Has splendor, and for us to reduce the diversity is to destroy that beauty, or to reduce the amount of that splendor, and that seems like a bad thing. So, you know, if you don't have to, like, just like if somebody, you say if there was a beautiful painting somewhere, and the artist was dead and gone, and the artist themselves didn't care about whether their paintings were preserved or not, but the painting itself was very beautiful, and somebody went in and just vandalized it, then we might say that's wrong because it ended up making things worse without any, better consequence. It took something that was beautiful and made it less beautiful, and there was no benefit or no sufficient benefit generated by making it less beautiful. In the same way, if we go out into the natural world and we see all of this splendor, this wide diversity of living things, and we just lop off parts of it, drive species to extinction, reduce the amount of diversity and the amount of splendor, then our actions can be criticized. Somebody can say, you're like the person who just defaced that painting. Whatever benefit you got from killing off those species, it isn't sufficient to justify the loss of beauty and the destruction of beauty that your action produced. So I have noted that this might be an aesthetic reason. Aesthetic, that word means having to do with art and beauty. So this reason may have mostly to do with a sense of the beauty of the natural world, some part of the natural world, in this case, the diversity of the natural world. And then a final argument is just that particular species are often important for ecosystems. So that showed up in the bison versus bear example. The bison, an individual bison, is less important to the overall ecosystem, the life of that individual bison, as opposed to the life of an individual grizzly bear. And so, insofar as the existence of a species is important for an ecosystem, I'm sorry, I should have put it in terms of the individual bison versus the bear species, since remember that it was the grizzly bears that were endangered, but not the bison. So particular species are often important for ecosystems. In this ecosystem, both the bison and the bear species would be important, but only the bear species were endangered, and that's why so much effort for their conservation was justified. So this is a derivative reason for the importance of species. We have to see why we should think ecosystems themselves are important before before this reason would work as a justification for why species are important. Because it's saying, species are important to ecosystems, so it's assuming that we think ecosystems are important. We have to see more what the reasons are for saying ecosystems are important. But that basically is this last argument in favor of the moral value of species.